Late summer, 1847. Glynn County, Georgia. Heat feathered the rafters of a shuttered room, and in the attic above it a cedar trunk endured the weight of another season. The roof breathed sap. Wasps stitched paper along a joist. Inside the trunk, layered as if by calendar rather than by hand, lay the family Bible, a receipts book pinned with a locket of hair, and the Plantation daybook wrapped in burlap, hidden away. The Bible told births and deaths in iron, gall ink until, at a certain year, the script stopped and the paper changed. Several leaves had been excised, not torn, but pared from the binding by a careful knife. What remained showed a steady hand trained for neatness, the sort of hand made to endure in a ledger. The receipts book smelled faintly of rice and tallow. Its margins carried sums of sugar and cloth, dates of freight, paid and unpaid notes. A lock of pale hair, threaded through a pinhole, had browned with time and oil. No caption named it. Beneath those, the daybook held the plantation's ordinary rations issued, bales counted, hands named in first names only and grouped by tasks, weather described in shorthand. Heavy fog AM, thunder distant PM. Its paper had gone soft at the edges, the ink blood where the humidity insisted upon it. In the gutter between two entries, a small flake of sealing wax had lodged and kept its red. Other fragments survived in the county files, each page stamped with the courthouse's embossed seal, the county's circular promise that ink could be a kind of truth. There was a clerk's signature, neat and obedient to the line. There were the physician's notes in a tight, right-leaning slant, each complaint couched in the era's phrasing: nervous disposition, domestic sorrow, excessive season. There was a midwife's ledger kept on coarse paper and mended with thread at one corner, her entries spare and precise as weather. And there were letters, a packet of them, addressed and folded, their wafers unbroken, their sentences deliberate. They were not stamped. They were never sent. The official words felt like inventory. The private ones felt like prayers spoken in a whisper to the wrong God. Between them stood a house known locally as Magnolia Ridge, and, within it, a woman whose hand appears again and again in the margins, tidying, correcting, making orderly what the world had refused to place in order for her. Out on the river, tidewater rose and fell in its own arithmetic. The fields held their lines. The road to the county seat was a ribbon of pale sand beaten firm by cartwheels that brought rice to wharves and news to porches. Some of it about distant fighting in Mexico, most of it about nearer fevers and ships, about a neighbor's poor yield or good fortune. Reputation traveled in these reports. So did warning. The law measured certain things with a frightening calm, and the books kept on desks reflected that calm back at those who lived beneath it. In that season, the Bible pages showed a problem, not easily named in a house that prized naming. A birth recorded, and then, in another hand that looked nearly the same, a correction. A line altered as if the ink itself needed to be put into better language. In the parish book down Reva, where baptisms were registered and the rector's script bowed dutifully to dates and doctrine, the surname on one infant's line lived under a pasted slip. Repair on another's defense rather than the pages. On a third record, far colder, in the probate inventory that counted chairs and benches, tools and livestock, the clerk inserted a line that did not belong among furniture. The phrasing was plain. Its cruelty lay in that plainness. These scraps, lifted and placed side by side, made a shape that was troubling in its tidiness. 2 births appeared for 1 child. A third line carried a valuation, not a name. The dates did not quarrel with each other. The handwriting did not change enough to accuse. The explanations, when they were offered at all, were the kind that smoothed, not the kind that revealed. We reconstruct this account from what survived the season and the decades that followed. It is dramatized only in voice. The facts are as the ink left them. Many pages were sealed in the courthouse and stayed so. Others came to us as copies made long after the hands that wrote them were still. Where a page was cut away, we say so. Where names were blurred by weather or time, we mark the blur and decline to guess. In later years, physicians trained in the cities called themselves alienists and wrote about moral strain and household melancholia In this part of Georgia in 1847, a physician was a physician and a midwife was a midwife, and each kept a book that did not always agree with the other. One clerk. His name appears in the docket several times, steady as a watermark, initialed a ledger at the end of that summer with a practiced flourish and closed it. The seal impressed into wax on the probate schedule cooled to a dull sheen. The daybook went beneath the Bible. The trunk went under the roof. For years no one disturbed the order of those papers, except the seasons themselves, which pressed their heat into the cedar and taught the ink to fade in the familiar ways of low country humidity. What the town believed, it kept mostly in its mouth rather than on its paper. You find it only indirectly, in a rector's reluctance to erase, in a doctor's careful private aside written smaller than his public notes, in the midwife's single cross beside a midnight entry, her sign for a struggle that did not honor the clock. You see it in the polite language of a letter that refers to arrangements and the needful quiet, in a receipts book where a sudden purchase, linen, christening white, interrupts a page of moldy feed and repairs to a sugar mill. The house itself appears in these lines like a patient in a case report, a nursery kept idly clean, a set of windows lit later than custom, a porch chair that does not move from one side of the planks to the other for weeks, as if its absence might say more than its presence. One hears, in the distance, the rational voice of order assuring all present that if the papers are correct, then the house must also be correct. One sees, in the gaps, another voice, the one that asks what the papers were asked to do. The county physician spoke in terms that made the body blame itself. Excess of season was a way to say the marsh had won. Domestic sorrow meant grief without a public name. The rector's admonition to charity meant, more often than not, silence. The clerk's complete return meant the court had nothing further to ask. Each phrase performed a smoothing. Each smoothing left a ridge under the page. This is how the matter first presents itself in the record, not as accusation, not as confession, but as an arrangement of ink meant to carry a reputation safely over a troubled crossing. The child, one child in the Bible, another in the parish, a valuation in the probate, becomes less a person than a problem a house tried to solve by writing it into different wakes, in different ways. To say more than that at the outset would be to claim knowledge we do not have. To say less would be to participate in the same tidying that made the problem necessary. In a line in the receipts book, a sum is paid out to R, then struck through, then written again with a fuller word. Rachel, as if the initial might hide her and the name might honor her. In the daybook, a week's issue of cloth is noted for the quarters, and later a smaller note appears in the margin. Inf. Garment muslin 1, no name, no size, simply the object. The season turned toward storm. An equinoctial tide pressed the river into the marsh and back again, and the sound carried the way it does when water lifts the world a little and then sets it down. The clerk who closed his ledger likely closed it, as he always did. No flourish announces history when it happens. Yet even on the page, where lives are reduced to lines, there is a tremor you learn to see. The places where a hand hesitated, the comma that is not a comma, but a touch of the nib left by a thought that arrived and had to be folded under. When the trunk lid came down, the cedar rattled softly. Dust took the chance to settle. Whatever explanations were spoken in that house that summer lived in voices that did not intend to be overheard by posterity. The papers were meant to suffice. In truth, they sufficed to keep the house together long enough for no one to ask a public question, long enough for a year to become the year we do not discuss, long enough for a name to be lifted from one place and laid down in another. This, then, is the beginning. We have a Bible with leaves pared out, a parish book with a pasted slip, a probate page with a line that should never have appeared among furniture, a daybook with a single word that reveals a room and refuses to reveal a life, 2 births set down for 1 child, a 3rd entry not kin, but goods. The handwriting matches, the dates agree, the pattern is intact. If this story intrigues you, subscribe and ring the bell, and tell us what city and state you're listening from. We map our archives by where you are. What follows in the record is not a single report, but a series of small, stubborn entries, each a card pulled from a drawer where someone tried to file away a season. Dates, places, handwriting, and the quiet oddities that begin to align. Case entry IF, March 22, 1847, the quarters Magnolia Ridge. What was found in Rachel's ledger. The midwife's book supplied by the county and bound without ornament. The entry for March 22 sits near midnight. The page is coarse rag paper, folded and refolded. The line begins in her usual neat, even hand. Delivered, child of M, at late hour. The word, boy, is later overwritten to girl, not with a blunt erasure, but with a careful stroke that preserves the original letter beneath. Beside the line is Rachel's cross, a small mark she used to denote a difficulty in labor. Beneath the entry, Rachel lists the ordinary notes: warm cloth broth, a draft for sleep. A second line below, written smaller and likely later that day, reads, sent to Big House Linens 2, swaddling cloth, 1. The ledger shows 2 inks on the same entry. The initial words are iron gall gone brown. The correction reads in a blacker hand that had not yet had time to fade. The spacing between words is unchanged. The paper surface, viewed at the right angle, bears the faint pressure of an original B. Its curl barely felt under the correction. Why it was odd is Rachel did not often correct her book. Where she did, she usually drew a single clean line through the mistake and wrote the proper term beside it. This overwriting is patience itself. Her supply note, linen sent to the big house, sits out of pattern. Such items typically move the other way around, from the house outward. A neighbor, Mrs. Granger of the next place, told the rector months later, in a note he kept pinned to the register, that the big house windows showed light very late that night. A window up, then down, she wrote, for no good sleep comes when a child is new. Hugh on the facing page of Rachel's ledger. An unusual absence: the mother's name, which Rachel typically recorded in full, appears only as an initial. None of this proves a second child, but it establishes a habit disturbed and a night that did not proceed in the ordinary order. Case entry Sishi, May 4, 1847, St. Luke's Parish, baptism register. What was found 2 months later, in Reverend Haskins's register, a baptism appears, an infant given a Harrow first name that recurs in that line, one of those stern, heirloom names that fathers pass to sons. The middle name is scriptural, the mother's name is present. The father's line is affirmed. The date places the right during the week. Captain Nathaniel Harrow returned from Savannah. A note supported by a separate bill for a sloop passage filed among the receipts. But the surname, a word that should be the least controversial mark on the page, lies under a slip of paper, hinges of paste at either end. Under light, the hidden line shows through faintly. The Harrow name, written in Haskins's careful hand, is there. On top of the slip, the same name appears again, marginally darker ink, marginally larger letters. Why it was odd. Parish registers do not wear patches like household books. When Haskins repaired tiers, he used narrow strips and wrote across them. When he corrected an error, he crossed and initialed. This slip, cut to fit the space of a name and fastened with gum, looks less like repair and more like overlay. In a private scrap, folded and kept in the register's backboard, Haskins has written, "Mother asked that the child be entered as we discussed." Without other notations, she spoke of reputation before God and men. I did not strike a name. I chose to preserve it beneath. Witness recollections for that day do not agree on details, only on tone. The church maid, whose name the record does not preserve, told a cousin that the mistress's face was set in a quiet. A godparent, Eliza's cousin from Augusta, did not sign, though she stood at the font. The absence of a signature is not unheard of, but Haskins usually marked such a thing with "present by intention." He did not hear. Case entry Etheroi, July 12, 1847, County Probate Office, Glynn County. What was found? A return to the probate judge. A mid-year inventory of movables for insurance and valuation. Lists the usual procession: chairs, tables, harness, bales awaiting shipment, tools by count and condition. Midway down the folio appears a line in the clerk's counting hand. One infant boy. The valuation is written plainly, as if the matter were as ordinary as a cradle. It follows a line for cradle, walnut, and proceeds, cloth, course, 2 bolts. In the margin, a note reads, transfer pending, followed by a single initial H. Why it was odd in official returns, enslaved children, when listed, typically appear with their mothers or as part of a household grouping. They are not often isolated between wood and cloth. The absence of a mother's name beside the line is out of keeping with the clerk's habit elsewhere on the page. The phrase, transfer pending, without a destination is also aberrant. When a transfer was known, the receiving estate or party would be noted. When unknown, the clerk would write, to be determined. The initial H could stand for Harrow, for Haskins, in his role as parish trustee, or for any number of nearby surnames beginning in H. It clarifies nothing. It only introduces the alphabet where a proper noun should be. The insurance agent's copy of the return, preserved in a separate file, carries a small difference. The valuation number has been adjusted faintly higher, then corrected back, the first figure still visible like a shadow. The agent initialed the correction. The county copy shows no such initials. Witnesses here are necessarily indirect. A young errand boy attached to the office. His name remembered only in a later annotation as James. The boy who ran told his employer, according to a note kept with a blotter, that Mrs. Harrow spoke quiet and careful to the judge in the hall, and that, the judge said, "Don't, then," and that was that. A case entry IV, September 3, 1847, Magnolia Ridge, the nursery. What was found? Dr. Bell's house call survives in 2 forms. In the official ledger he filed quarterly with the county, the entry reads, visited Mrs. H for nervous complaint, administered draught, advised rest. In his pocket notebook, kept for himself and later salvaged from a desk drawer, the same date holds more, infant well formed. Note, mark at left shoulder observed in spring, not present today. Mother composed, house very tidy for nursery. A Bell's habit in his private book was to note distinguishing marks, scars, moles, birth signs, injuries, in the way physicians do when they know that memory can betray a man. In an earlier spring entry, the March date is referenced obliquely, saw infant in passing, mark like a small plum at shoulder. The September note questions its own recollection, but underlines the absence twice. Bell also adds a line that appears nowhere else in his records that year, room arranged, objects placed. Sense that things were set for viewing. Why it was odd. In the nursery of a new child, disorder is ordinary. Bell noted order, almost display. The absence of a mark he believed he saw is not proof of anything except a mind, trying to reconcile memory and sight. Still, the physician took care to write it in a hand smaller than usual, as if reluctant to see it larger. He did not append a diagnosis. He did not share the note with the county. Additional observations and minor entries, a series of smaller notations, taken together, acts like stitching between the larger seams. April 6, 1847. Daybook, Magnolia Ridge, from store christening calico, white, ribbon blue. The family's receipts book shows a matching purchase in town with a separate notation. For the other, muslin plain. 2 items for 2 rituals, 1 celebratory, 1 practical. April 9, 1847. Rachel's ledger, Mother Strong. Beneath, faint engraved by thumb. Senti milk, extra wet nurse to house 3 days. No name for the nurse, which is unusual. Rachel often recorded them, perhaps in solidarity, perhaps in pride. June 17, 1847. Parish loose leaf. Haskins jots a text for a sermon on charity and truth, with a marginalia, there are truths a house cannot bear in the street. Whether preached or not, the sentence lives in his hand. August 1, 1847. Probate office in, letter, undelivered, a draft from a Savannah solicitor to the judge requesting confirmation that the transfer alluded to in the return dated July 12 should be effected without public notice. The letter bears no stamp, no outward address. It was filed as miscellaneous, perhaps as leverage, perhaps as caution. August 19, 1847. Store ledger town, sewing woman paid, 2 days, baby things. The signature is a cross. The clerk adds, for M.H. Whether the M stands for Magnolia or for a person, the book does not declare. Each of these small marks by itself could be explained as household life, the ordinary rush of a season with a child. Together, they begin to draw the outline of a house, keeping two narratives, one for the court, one for the parish, one in a Bible, and one in a day book. Witness observations and red flags in later years, when memories hardened into stories. People said the windows told the tale, a room lit at hours out of step, a curtain held just so, the nursery chair kept in the same place week after week, as if moving it might disturb the arrangement. A seamstress, one of those women who traveled from place to place with a basket and a skill, remarked to the storekeeper that the baby's gown she mended in April did not fit the baby she saw in August. Though growth can explain such things, and she did not claim more than that. The storekeeper copied her remark on a spare line of his ledger, as if the thought itself might be a commodity to be weighed later. A farmhand delivering a message to the big house in June told his cousin, who told a neighbor, that the mistress hushed the nursery as she opened the door, then smiled when she saw who stood on the threshold, as if the quiet had been rehearsed. The county holds none of these whispers officially. What it holds is the pattern-corrected entries, overlaid names, an inventory line that looks more like an argument than a description. Across the four principal documents, the same qualities repeat: precision, where there is usually ease; vagueness, where the record usually insists on precision; paste, where there is usually ink. The dates line up across books kept by people who shared a season, but not a purpose. The child at the center remains largely unnamed in the official voice. The people who tended him, Rachel, the physician, the minister, leave only their careful habit as evidence of alarm. The house's story, told in these entries, is not one of noise, but of arrangement, of a problem addressed by pushing it into the places where law and custom would treat it gently if the words were chosen correctly. The incidents do not shout. They sit in their lines and, together, they suggest a hand that believed a page could be persuaded to carry more than it should. What passed for an investigation in 1847 Glynn County began not with lanterns in fields, but with hands on paper. A sheriff reviewed returns. A doctor submitted his ledger at quarter's end. A rector looked down the parish book and decided what the page could carry without doing harm to a soul or to a household. The law's gaze was administrative before it was inquisitive. When a question lived inside a family of standing, the county tended to trust the family's own order. Sheriff Alton Pierce was the first public eye on the matter, though the record grants him no drama. His notes are short, even for him. He logged the July inventory, and its unusual line for one infant boy as complete, a term he used when the figures footed and the signatures matched. He did not call on Magnolia Ridge or ask why the transfer line bore only a single initial. He had been taught to mind the difference between domestic and public business. The Harrows, standing, and the judge's words in the hall, Doan, then, set a boundary he did not cross. Dr. Horace Bell's role was quieter, and his conflict sharper. He was a physician serving the whole county, dependent on households like Magnolia Ridge for payment and access. His official notes stayed on the safe side of clinical faintness, draughts, a general prescription of rest. In his private notebook, written smaller, tucked away, he captured those details that made him uneasy. The mark he thought he had seen on a child in spring absent in autumn, the sensation that a nursery had been arranged for viewing more than for use. He did not draw conclusions. He underlined dates. He left space after sentences, as if expecting to come back with a word he never found. Reverend Haskins was a different kind of investigator, bound to a book that stood as both sacrament and registry. What he chose to preserve says more than what he dared to write. He would not strike a name. He passed it over it, creating a palimpsest that held two truths at once: the parish's public page, and the trace of a private insistence beneath. His loose scrap, "There are truths a house cannot bear in the street," reads like a sermon outline and a confessional. He appealed to the bishop for guidance on how to handle a household's request that contradicted parish habit. The letter remained with his own papers. Whether he ever sent it, The files do not say. Rachel, the midwife, stood closest to the facts and farthest from the record's authority. Her ledger line, with its overwriting, its cross for a difficult labor, its subsequent note sending linens up to the big house, functions as testimony, but the law did not call it that. The county acknowledged her work with a small fee and a shop account. It did not swear her to a witness chair. When a later inquiry cites, Hannah not sworn, it is a shorten not for her reliability, but for her station. The probate judge appears not as an investigator but as a gatekeeper. The inventory passed across his desk, its peculiar line intact. Whatever conversation occurred in the hall with Mrs. Harrow, and the errand boy's memory, left no ink. His stamp gave the paper its authority. In that act, he became part of the arrangement, whether he knew the matter in full or not. The insurance agent offered the only visible resistance, a valuation number faintly revised and then restored, his initials marking the correction. Insurance men protected risk. He may have understood what others pretended not to see, that the presence or absence of a single line could change the value of a household in ways his arithmetic was not designed to measure. The Savannah solicitor, represented in a draft letter that never left the file, did what solicitors were paid to do, ask that a transfer alluded to be handled without public notice. His phrasing assumed discretion as a kind of virtue. It positioned silence as a professional service. In this was the conflict between rumor and record. Rumor moved swiftly and made meaning of small details, a gown that fit differently in August than in April, a child who seemed a touch older or younger than a date suggested, a birthmark remembered by a physician and then not found. The record, by contrast, moved slowly and subsumed those details under phrases designed to quiet domestic sorrow. No irregularity, complete return, private notes, Bell's underlined absences, Haskins's slip, Rachel's cross, sat between, mute but stubborn. To speak plainly about what the county would not name, later writers adopted the vocabulary available to them. In 1873, a medical lecturer from Augusta, writing in a pamphlet on melancholia and moral strain in domestic women of the South, recounted, without names, a lady of the Tidewater who believed that to keep her house in order was to keep the truth from doing harm. He placed her distress within what alienists of the time called moral insanity, a concept swollen with bias and vague enough to shelter a dozen meanings. He suggested that respectable women under pressure could come to arrange facts as they arranged parlors, not to deceive, but to survive. His words pathologized and excused in the same breath. They did not touch the law. In the 1890s, a county schoolmaster turned historian published a booklet of Glynn sketches. One page, written as anecdote, mentioned the lady who kept two ledgers, one for the Almighty and one for the probate. He claimed no sources. He claimed, instead, tradition, as told to me upon a porch at dusk. He was not investigating. He was embalming rumor as local color. Closer to the papers themselves, the niece who opened the trunk, near the turn of the century, acted like an archivist without the name. She separated the Bible from the daybook, copied the letters on onion skin, and added a pencil note, to be considered by someone braver. She had no authority to compel answers. She did the only thing the record allows the living to do, keep the questions together. Against this background, the competing theories converge around the same handful of facts and diverge in their interpretation. The official line to facts: the winter and spring of 1847 were hard in the Low Country. Fever persisted, and infant deaths were not rare, though the record says little about them beyond tally marks beneath a name. A birth in March, a baptism in May, a household inventory in July, a physician's visit in September. Each event sits comfortably within a calendar of ordinary life. Corrections in ledgers happen. Patches in parish books, while uncommon, occur. A valuation line could be a clerk's clumsy placement. A transfer could be delayed. A mark on a shoulder might fade or be misremembered. No complaint was filed, no criminal inquiry opened. The judge's stamp and the rector's entry stand. This line treats the house of Harrow as a house, afflicted by misfortune and sensitive to propriety. The letters in the trunk, in this reading, are the words of a woman managing grief with tidiness. It requires no conspiracy, only a preference for order in a season prone to chaos. The quiet hypothesis, speculation, the papers suggest a deliberate arrangement, two narratives kept parallel, one in the Bible and parish, one in the daybook and probate. The paste overkeeps a name legible to those who know where to look. The midwife's overwritten, boy. To girl, the upward movement of linens. The wet nurse loaned to the big house, hint at a child whose classification mattered beyond the nursery. Given the law of partis sequitur ventrum, status following the mother, the classification of an infant could carry enormous consequence. In such a world, a household might attempt a substitution, presenting a child of one mother as the child of another, or it might quietly move a child whose parentage complicated inheritance out of the line of kinship and into the ledger of property. The draft letter to the solicitor, expedite the transfer quietly, reads in this light as facilitation, not consolation. Dr. Bell's observation about a missing mark and his sense that a room was arranged suggest an awareness of presentation beyond ordinary pride. The probate line, isolated between wood and cloth, reads less like a mistake and more like a test of what the page could bear. This theory does not insist upon a single exchange or a single motive. It names pressure, reputation, inheritance, the rigid arithmetic of law, as the engine, and it credits Mrs. Harrow with learning how officials read a scene, that order persuades, that neatness closes files. The folklore, town memory, the version that lived longest on porches reduces complexity to a curse. It speaks of a bloodline, crossed, and of a house, protecting itself, by trading infants or ting fates. It remembers the vanishing of a birthmark as proof of substitution, rather than as the uncertain memory of a physician who wrote his doubts as well as his observations. Folklore preserves emotion at the cost of detail. It relieves the teller of the duty to explain law and ledger by invoking fate. It satisfies the listener who wants a moral where the archive offers only ambiguity. It also wounds by turning people into symbols, mistress, midwife, infant, so that their particularity is lost. Separating facts from speculation from folklore is a discipline and a mercy. The facts are the papers we can touch. Rachel's ledger, Haskins's register with its pasted slip, the probate return with its single stark line, Dr. Bell's neatly peined pocketbook, the draft to a solicitor, the letters that repeat the words order, arrangement, reputation. Speculation lives in the pattern they make when placed side by side, a pattern that suggests intent without producing confession. Folklore lives in the spaces between, where no paper goes. As for who investigated, the answer is unsatisfying and true, everyone and no one. The sheriff saw numbers. The judge granted a stamped silence. The doctor observed and did not accuse. The rector preserved beneath a patch what he would not erase. The midwife wrote a cross and was not called to speak. The solicitor composed sentences that made quiet a virtue. A niece kept the trunk and deferred her courage to a stranger not yet born. In the end, the theories have to sit with that silence. The next turn would not produce an indictment or an arrest. It would produce a packet labeled in a familiar hand. Household issue, private. And inside it, a vocabulary that explained much and confessed nothing. The turn did not come with a warrant. It came with a key and a reluctance to look away. Near the turn of the century, when the house was being readied for a sale, and the living were disposing of the dead's effects, a niece, who had inherited the duty if not the certainty, opened the cedar trunk in the hot room above the shutters. She had already found the Bible with its paired leaves, the receipts book with its locket, the daybook wrapped in burlap. What remained was the weight of the trunk itself, heavier than the visible papers explained. She lifted the tray and ran her fingers along the dovetail. A shallow panel shifted. Beneath lay a packet wrapped in oil paper, bound with twine darkened by years and handling. On the wrapper, in a hand she knew from the household accounts, the words, household issue, privata. Inside was a narrow memorandum book of calfskin, the sort a factor might carry to the river. The paper was finer than the daybook's coarse rag, the ink darker, the hand steadier, a schoolroom script training itself to control the world. On the flyleaf, written faintly in pencil, a legend, a small cross, then the word parish, a small circle, then probate, a line, then household only. It was not a confession. It was an index for 2 ledgers. The first page for 1847 opened to 2 mapped columns. On the left, names and events that matched the county's polite memory, at font St. Luke's. Name bestowed, Rev. H. Visitors, cousin from Augusta. Return of Captain N. The phrases were terse, the letters careful, as if addressed to a future reader who might not be sympathetic and who would need assurance that all was in order. On the right, shorter lines, unembellished and coded by the flyleaf's marks, a circle for items meant to appear in the judge's rooms, a line for matters meant never to leave the house. March 22. Late, Rachel called X, a single word, boy, then a small caret above it and, in the margin, core. G. Linum, Satu, witness, 3 days. May 4, font name as arranged Sile X or July 12, transfer penned. Cho, Do, Sept. 3. Physician, nursery set. The entries did not explain, they aligned. The cross beside March conformed to Rachel's notation. The font date matched the parish. The transfer line used the same unhelpful initial and the same chilly phrasing as the probate return. The last remark, nursery set, echoed the doctor's sense of a room arranged for display. Tucked into the back of the memorandum book lay a folded sheet. A list of initials without surnames, each followed by a short note in the same small, unemotional hand. R. Attentive, thanked. H. Agreeable to discretion. B. To be managed, does not love quiet. A column to the right labeled tokens. Listed small objects and gestures. Gown made up. Calico. Coin for boy. It read like the calculus of a woman who understood the need to attend to those who made a plan possible, and to avoid the few who might oppose it. No sums appear, only the arithmetic of obligation. Beneath the memorandum book lay the letters. They were addressed but unsent, their red wafers never moistened. 1. To the Savannah solicitor. Took up the vocabulary the county would later inherit from alienists. We must preserve the order of the house. She wrote that, I ask your aid in arranging the matter in such a way that nothing untoward is required of the parish, and the probate may be satisfied without public notice. She did not specify the matter. She did not use words the court would balk at. Expedite the transfer quietly. She wrote, in consideration of our name and the child's peace. Another letter, to the cousin in Augusta. Rehearsed the same reasoning but in the grammar of kin. You know how Glyn is. They forgive nothing that troubles their sense of neatness. I have done the neat thing. It is not unkind. It prevents the unkindness of talk. She offered scripture by way of justification. All things be done decently and in order. And then resolve that decency in her own shorthand. 2 books must agree, the one for God, the one for court. A third letter carried no address. It read more like instruction to herself. The lines clipped as if she had already memorized them. Do not permit the doctor to be alone with the child. Call for Rachel if the mark is made mention. Keep the nursery arranged. What is not entered cannot be disputed. There was, pressed into one fold, a thin ribbon the color of old water. It mirrored the ribbon pinned through the locket in the receipts book. To call it evidence would be to make too much of a small thing, that to ignore it would be to miss the way the house turned sentiment into record. The niece who found the packet did a small, brave thing. She copied the letters in a trembling hand onto onion skin, wrote the word, copy, at the top of each page, and slid the originals back beneath the calfskin. On the first copy she added in pencil, to be considered, and dated it in her own year. She did not take them to the judge. She did not burn them. She placed them with the Bible and the daybook, as if believing that keeping the papers together might preserve a truer shape than any of them could manage alone. Years later, when the annex was built and the courthouse emptied its drawers, someone, perhaps a clerk with a conscience, perhaps Ruth Carraway with her neat, sympathetic type, made a small file card, Harrow Papers, household issue, privacy. See also probate return 12 July 1847, St. Luke's Register, May 4, 1847, Bell, pocket notebook. In that act, the private vocabulary entered the public index. If there was a revelation in these pages, it was not the melodrama of a confession, it was the quiet recognition of a method. The flyleaf's legend, cross, circle, line, was the key to the house's season. It taught us how to read the two ledgers together, what appeared at the font, and in the Bible with hairpins and blessings, what appeared in the probate with numbers and seals, what the house kept to itself, under oil paper and cedar. The memorandum book's right-hand column showed that decisions had been made and marked. The letters showed how those decisions were justified to a mind convinced that order could be a species of mercy. The pattern, once seen, could not be unseen. The midwife's overwriting, boy to girl, ceased to look like a stumble and began to look like an instruction. The pasted slip in the parish register ceased to look like repair and began to look like compromise. Probate's cold line, one infant, boy, ceased to look like a clerk's error and began to look like a phrase chosen with care to satisfy a category without waking a quarrel. Even Dr. Bell's uncertainty about a mark felt less like a flaw in memory and more like the consequence of a household training his eye with arrangement. None of this proved what rumor preferred. It did not show a hand in a cradle or a switch in the night. It showed a woman learning the county's grammar and speaking it back to the county with fluency, that propriety could close a book, that tidy rooms could persuade an official view, that the absence of ink could be as decisive as ink. The harm, such as we can name it safely, lay in the system that allowed a child's status to be altered by where his name was placed and what column he occupied. The papers do not tell us what became of those whose names were reduced to initials. They tell us only that a plan was made and that the plan relied upon silence, stamps, and the patience of a neat hand. From that moment, the story was no longer a quarrel between old women on porches. It became the study of a vocabulary, order, arrangement, necessity, decency, words that traveled from a doctor's notes to a mistress's letters, from a clerk's margin to a rector's scrap. The packet labeled household issue, private, did not loosen the sealed chancery or summon an indictment. It did something colder and more enduring. It showed that in 1847, in a county that prized neatness above almost anything, a private ledger could teach a public one how to forget. The file returns to its shelf. The Bible closes on its thinned leaves. The daybook rests under burlap. The memorandum marked household issue, privity, keeps its small alphabet of crosses and circles, a grammar of order that persuaded a county to be done. We step back from the paper and find that the chill comes not from what is written, but from what the writing can make disappear. If you have followed the ink through 1847, Rachel's cross, Haskins's paste, Bell's underlined doubt, the probate's single stark line, you know how little the record requires to sound certain. You also know how much is asked of those who live beneath that certainty. A house that learned to speak in the county's calm could move a life from one column to another and call the motion necessary. One question remains, and it is the one we will leave with you. Which reading best fits the evidence? The official line of misfortune and propriety, the quiet hypothesis of arrangement across two ledgers, or the town's folklore about a curse simplified into legend? Choose one, and tell us why the papers persuaded you. If this story intrigues you, subscribe and ring the bell. Your subscription keeps these sealed rooms open, and these careful lines in the light. If the work we've done here matters to you, leave a like. It is a small mark, but in an archive of attention it helps us be found. And tell us what city and state you're listening from. We are mapping where these records reach, county to county, porch to porch. Next time, we open another set of pages that preferred silence to truth, a sealed file from a river town that kept its secrets under the floorboards, where an asylum ledger and a carpenter's journal contradict each other by a single date. Until then, hold fast to the lesson Magnolia Ridge leaves behind, that official truth is often the tidiest version that survives, and that compassion begins where the ledger ends.